One of the questions that we want to discuss on this panel is what are the incentives and how do we get them adopted? How do we want to organize ourselves to work? Because there are new ways of working that are emerging in the scientific world right now. And finally, one question that I really want to focus on coming out of this meeting so that there is some value created today other than the discussion that we've had, and that is how can GBSI work with both the organizations on this panel as well as with all of you to advance the topics and issues that we've explored together today as a new initiative. So first I'm just going to ask everybody on the panel to introduce themselves, and then I'm going to give each one of you maybe a 5-minute opportunity to talk about your work and what you do, and then I'll have some questions for you, and then we can throw it open to the audience. Okay? Go ahead.
Yeah, so hi everybody, I'm Rob Siemans. I'm a professor at New York University's Stern School of Business. So I think unlike everybody else here, perhaps I'm a social scientist as opposed to a real scientist.
I'm Alex Morgan. I'm an investor with Khosla Ventures. We're a Silicon Valley investment firm that does a lot of work in health and biotechnology, although we invest broadly in all kinds of other things, from food to we have a rocket company in New Zealand to things in energy, but also a lot of traditional Silicon Valley tech-type investments in consumer internet and things in fintech.
I'm Jennifer Hansen. I work for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I'm a senior officer and lead the open access policy and development around open at the foundation.
I'm Carleen Strasser. I'm a program officer at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation based out of Palo Alto. And we fund all kinds of things, but I'm working with the science program.
Hey everybody, my name is Jeremy Freeman. I'm the director of computational biology at the Zuckerberg Initiative. So this is a newly formed organization. It's been around for about a year now, and I'm basically developing our strategy and our projects that are at the intersection of science and biology on the one hand, and sort of computation and software and data analysis and data infrastructure and all those wonderful things on the other hand. Before coming to CZI, I was running a computational neuroscience lab at Genelia Research Campus.
I'm Tim Gardner, founder of Riffyn. You heard me before, so you know a little bit about me. My background is actually a combination of machine learning and microbial genetics. I spent 20 years in biotech and founded a software company 3 years ago to try to deliver a qualitatively different approach to experimentation, one that elevates the experiment as a shareable, visual, computable object rather than an aside that you shove into the back of a paper and don't think about.
Great, thank you. So does each of you want to just take a few minutes and kind of summarize the work that you've been doing in the areas that we're talking about today?
Yeah, sure. So I'm an economist by training. I spent, so I'm back at NYU now, but I spent last year working for President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. I was working specifically on issues that had to do with the economics of technology and innovation, and an issue that came up all the time was on robotics and automation. And so I've been very excited today because this is sort of something that obviously has come up a lot today. Whenever I'm interacting with my economist colleagues, something that comes up a lot is this issue of automation and the extent to which it might be substituting for labor. Right? This just comes up all the time. So one of the things that's really exciting about what I've been hearing today are all the different ways in which technology and automation are potentially sort of complements, right, to what labor is doing. And so that's something that's been very exciting for me.
So we invest in a lot of companies that are at the intersection of biology and AI, and that often has a component of automation or at least automatic feature extraction or induction. We're investors in Opentrons, so that's a way that we're connected to a lot of what you've been discussing today. I think one of the questions that was posed to me in advance about how I think about business models here is that I'm personally very interested, and we as a firm, a lot of things in precision medicine. And the question is, are there business models in reproducible research? And I think in order at sort of zero level of a business is to have a product that works. And in order to have a product that works in precision medicine, you need to have something that's reproducible on the measurement or in the production of the therapeutic side, often in a customized and unique or individualized way. And that's really only going to be possible with many of the kinds of technologies or even the protocols that are being discussed today, and so that people both have a confidence and understanding of the data that's produced and know how to build the tools and the infrastructure and the whole economy and set of products and businesses on top of that. So I think it's not a question that it's important and sort of fundamental to a lot of the businesses and the sort of the future that we see, I see in healthcare and biotechnology as a larger, maybe superset of healthcare.
So the last panel, I have to say I was just wanting to have so much comments on what we were talking about and discussing in terms of responsibility, collective, the system that we all work in. And I like to bring this back to why we're here and what we want to do with science, right? So for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, our core belief is that all lives have equal value, and everything that we do leads up to that, right? So our mission is to ensure that everyone has the ability to lead a healthy, productive life. And everything that we do, all the policies that we have, feed into that. And so that's our base, that's where we go. So when we have policies and we think about how do we make research more available, faster, that in order to save lives. And so that's what we do. And I think that's really important because we get kind of stuck in this, okay, this is what we're going to do, this is the tool, this is the service, and to really come back to why we are here and why you're scientists and why you do the things that you do. And I'm looking forward to having a conversation in terms of how do we collectively do this, work together, create a system that enables science to be rapidly disseminated with the proper rigor and reproducibility.
So within the Moore Foundation, I work in the science program, but specifically I work on an initiative that is a $60 million 6-year initiative called the Data-Driven Discovery Initiative, and we really focus on figuring out how to promote academic data science. And so we do that through funding 3 universities to set up data science environments and really foster something that happens on campus. We also have 14 investigators that we fund from all different kinds of backgrounds, but everything from people that are experts in machine learning or building genomics tools to ecologists. And then we also have a set of tools that we fund, so open source software tools that are used by folks to do academic data science in general. And I think all 3 of these programs, one of the challenges of being a funder is figuring out how to measure and evaluate the work that you fund. And it's particularly challenging if the types of work that you fund tend to result in things like software or data, as opposed to the more traditional publications. And so we think a lot within our initiative about how to reward open science, how to measure the types of work that the people that we fund are doing, and it proves to be a lot more intricate than just kind of having a bibliometric analysis, which I think is what a lot of science funding has relied on in the past. So that's the initiative with regards to science, and we do think a lot about open science and transparency and reproducibility in that part of the work. And then I have another set of things that I think about a lot, which is in the scholarly communication space. And so we are one of the funders of the ASAP Bio program, which is trying to figure out ways to advance the use of preprints in biology. And we've also funded the Collaborative Knowledge Foundation, which is building out an open source platform for publishing, which is intended to help facilitate incorporating things like data software, workflows, Jupyter notebooks into the actual publications that are being put out there.
Cool. So the long-term goal of the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, where I am, we are trying to accelerate progress in biology and really all of biomedicine. And to us, accelerate means a whole bunch of things. It means to find ways to make science and the work scientists are doing more robust, word that's been used a lot today, more reproducible, more efficient, and honestly, my sort of very personal version of that is just to make it so scientists that are already doing incredible work can do more of what they're doing and do it better. The number of times that I've seen a grad student or a postdoc in the lab sort of deal with things that are frustrating and if those things were solved, they could do 4 times as many experiments as they're doing. To me, that's the big picture. If they're doing 4 times as many experiments, or learning 4 times as quickly about what other people are doing, they're then going to be 4 times more likely or 4 times faster to make some amazing discovery. In terms of how CZI is trying to do this, we are like a somewhat unusual organization, and I think I know we're unusual because it keeps confusing people what we do. It's really 2 things. One is funding. So as a philanthropic organization, we fund experimental scientists, we fund computational scientists, we can fund other kinds of groups. We're also a software engineering team. So we have within CZI a very quickly growing software engineering group that is very involved actively in building collaboratively with other groups and very much in the open and through open source tools, building software for data analysis, data visualization, sort of data infrastructure for data sharing, and all kinds of other ways to sort of build infrastructure to support science. And to me, the most exciting thing about what we're doing is we're trying to combine those 2 things. Because I think all across science, there are really exciting opportunities when you can sort of simultaneously combine the funding of science with very targeted development of tools and technologies, especially in terms of software, because as we all know, that's something that can, when used properly, sort of truly scale and have really significant leverage in terms of moving certain areas of science forward. So a lot of what we're doing is thinking about how to combine those 2 things in new and exciting ways. We're doing this through a whole bunch of projects that we're very much still in the process of getting off the ground. And this includes, just as a few examples, we're very involved in supporting, among others, a very large international project called the Human Cell Atlas, which is an effort to map all the cells in the human body. So this is a big international collaborative project. Seamans is not the only one involved. It's led by Viv Regev and Sarah Teichman of the Broad Institute and EBI. So it's this awesome project, and we're trying to find ways to support it, including things like building a sort of modern open source cloud-based data coordination platform for the project, as well as actually just announced today, funding a bunch of experimental scientists developing really cool new experimental technologies. We're also now a big and sort of key supporter of the bioRxiv preprint server for biology, and we're working with bioRxiv, again, to combine these 2 things, both funding and supporting their team, but also involved in helping them sort of expand the functionality of that service and sort of improve it in new and cool ways. So those are a couple examples of the kinds of things we're involved in, and we're also constantly and currently in the process of ramping up new projects as well.
I'm Tim Gardner, founder of Riffyn, and rather than tell you about Riffyn, which I already did earlier today, I thought I'd start with an observation, which is that, well, it's a belief that one of the problems with reproducibility and why we don't have as much of it as we'd like is because there's insufficient consumption of science. So if you look at industry and you ask, why is a product, a car, an iPhone, or any other product you buy good? It's because there's a lot of people buying it, and if they don't get something that's of high quality, they'll take it back. And they'll fight with customer service and they'll complain. If nobody bought it, there'd be no one to tell you that it stinks. And if you got the funding to keep going and producing that thing that nobody was buying, you'd keep making shoddy products. So the pressure to improve your products in industry comes from the consumption of that. In academia, the pressure to improve the reproducibility comes from funders and perhaps a little bit universities, but not really, and journals. It's primarily funders and journals. But that's a little bit like your parents telling you to do better. You don't do that, but if your friends tell you you stink at basketball, you'll probably try to play better. So I think we need more of that peer-driven pressure, which is the consumption of science. And what that does, it really changes your relationship. And I'll give you a very simple example of that. It's kind of an absurd example, but suppose, so I have kids 8 and 11, and if somebody was a consumer of their height and they said, tell me if your child has grown in the past year, I would pull out a ruler, stick them on the wall and measure it and look at it relative to where they were last year. And I'm like, they grew. It's not very hard to tell. If they asked me, I need to know if your kid has grown this week, it's a totally different ballgame. You need a completely different measurement system to do that. And without any demand for science, we don't really have understanding of what it is we need to achieve, and without that, we don't really have any concept of what's good enough to be reproducible or good enough to answer a question. And so I think we need, and I don't know the answer to this, but we need to bring in that element, that consumption of science into the equation in a much more forceful way if we really want to drive change. It's my observation.
Great. So let me just ask each one of you a few questions, and you can also comment on what you heard the other speakers saying in addition to answering these questions. So, Jeremy, you are tasked with speeding up science for the Zuckerberg Foundation. And so what does that mean for you exactly in the context of the programs that you just described?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I can actually tie it into the consumption question as well. I really like that story. So I think to me, there's a few of these big words we throw around that are important for speeding up science. I think it means making it more robust, the work that scientists do, sort of if there are protocols that yield unsatisfying or unreliable results, making them better, making the work we do reproducible in maybe even just the narrow sense that if one person in one lab does something, the other postdoc in the lab is able to sort of do the same experiment and at least put on paper or in the computer a comparison of the results of the two. I think efficiency in the, again, sort of maybe just very narrow sense I gave before of making it easier to do more experiments. I am often very much of the belief that scientists are doing incredible work already, and there are just a few dimensions of their work that are slowing them down. And I certainly spend a lot of time now back in my previous lab at Genelia working with labs who've developed these like incredible new microscopes for monitoring large-scale patterns of neural activity in the brain, hundreds of thousands of neurons simultaneously in awake-behaving animals, and like instruments that no one else in the world could possibly have developed or let alone use, and they're spending 20% of their time collecting data from that instrument and 80% of their time basically futzing with the complexities of like Java version management and Java installations, just to sort of not do anything fancy with the data, but just like deal with literally like putting the images up on a screen and looking at them. Like pretty fundamentally basic problems with the data analysis. And I think there are pretty deep reasons for that. I don't think it's a trivial problem. And that's a lot of what we're thinking about now is that if the problem is how much time is being spent on those kinds of aspects of kind of working with and organizing data and learning from the other scientists around you, then are there kind of targeted things we can do to make a difference in those areas? And maybe I think how to figure out how to do that and exactly what would accelerate science, to me the most important thing is something we say a lot, which is staying close to the work. I think you have to go work in labs with scientists to figure out where these challenges are. I don't think we can come up with it in a room, either this room or any other. I think the only answer is to actually go out there. So something we do a lot in our group, many of the people in our group go spend time in labs, and we actually work collaboratively with scientists to work with them in the lab, understand their problem, analyze their data with them, try to understand what solutions might look like.
So a lot of that has to do with how we organize ourselves to work, right? And there's been some discussion this afternoon about the different types of organizations in which science actually occurs. And you have spent your time in 3 different types of scientific institutions. So you were in academia, then you were an independent research institute, and now you're with the Zuckerberg Foundation, which is an LLC, which is a very new type of organization that's actually quite new and is revolutionizing the way scientific philanthropy is being done. So could you comment on what it feels like to work in those different environments and the incentives there?
Yeah, they've all been a lot of fun, and they're all different in I don't want to be cheesy. They're all their own special snowflake. I mean, I really believe that each of these organizations bring something really important to science right now. I think in kind of traditional academia, there's a certain kind of freedom of exploration that I think is really kind of maybe unmatched. The ability to go into a sort of dark room in the back of a building for 5 years and just experiment and try things, I think is kind of unparalleled and really important to somehow preserve. I think a sort of independent research institute in some ways has a place like Genelia had as much freedom as possible, basically because once you're at a place like Genelia, you're no longer competing for funding, at least for the period of time that you're there. I think places like Genelia also have the these sort of organized research institutes have the opportunity to really kind of coalesce around a big project or a big question. I also think about examples like the Allen Institute. Really incredible things happen when lots of people get together and decide we are going to do high throughput characterization of all the cell types in this part of the brain. Or we're going to reinvent or dramatically improve by orders of magnitude the capabilities of a fluorescent protein sensor. That's one of, to me, the most exciting projects at Genelia. To all rally around a big project like that and make sort of coordinated, cohesive progress within a small space, that's incredible. It's different than the much more distributed and sort of frothy and in some ways slowly evolving, but I also think really critical progress that happens through what I'll call sort of traditional government-funded kind of academic science, where things do to some extent happen slowly. They are not always as coordinated. I think that's also where breakthroughs happen, because lots of interesting ideas kind of spawning and evolving in lots of different places is also, I think, a really important part of science, the sort of cottage industry feel. I guess CZI, is definitely yet another kind of organization, and that, again, sort of what I said before, but to sort of reiterate, it's really that we're trying to bring together, in some ways, the combination of sort of funding distributed science, but then also doing sort of research organization-like work, and that we have a large software engineering team that in a fairly coordinated, cohesive fashion is actually building tools. We have computational scientists that are out in the labs, working with scientists, analyzing their data, trying to solve fairly coordinated problems. And I guess what's unique about that is that we can find very targeted ways to support science by putting those two things together as best as possible. So if, for example, we believe that funding 20 labs to do a new kind of experimental science would be way more impactful if those 20 labs also had a coordinated data platform in which they could share all the data that they're generating as part of those experiments and make that data available to the entire scientific community. What's unique about CZI is that we also can then have a software engineering team help develop that data platform to accelerate the needs of those 20 labs. So I think that combination, from everything I've seen, is definitely super exciting to me, but I think all three models are really important to the field at large.
Great, thank you. Jennifer, I was really struck by the kind of fundamental principle that you were talking about, which drives the activities for the Gates Foundation. And so I'm wondering if you could comment on how openly sharing information accelerates that mission and the impact that the Gates Foundation seeks to have.
Yeah, so one of the things when we were developing our open access policy in 2013, we were trying to figure out what would have the most impact for the research that we fund. And we realized that the research that we funded was behind paywalls, and it took a while to get to the journal article, to get to the journal. So when we started out, we didn't really think about an open access policy. We were just talking about a publication policy. We don't have one. We were asked what our publication policy was, so we were like, all right, we should probably have one. We've been around for almost 13 years, and so we're a little late to the party, for sure. So when we were developing the policy, we were talking about what could we do to accelerate the research that we produce, because that is when you think about what our product is, it's the research that we fund. That's our product. That's what we're measured by. So when we developed the policy, the things that came up were no embargo. Like, why do we have to wait 12 months in a journal article to access a journal article? The other thing is licensing. I think licensing is a huge deal. We talked about all of these tools and all these really awesome things that you guys are working on, but if you don't have the proper licensing for the data, then you can't do anything with it. And so I think that's really, really fundamental in order to accelerate research and to have access to the entire corpus. If you don't have access to the entire corpus, then it doesn't really matter, right? You need to be able to have the licensing to do that. The other thing that we talked about was findable and discoverable, right? I mean, if it's there and you can't find it, it doesn't really matter. And then our commitment as a foundation is that we would pay for those fees that you would have to when you publish on those terms. And I think that was a big deal because when we announced the policy, there was a lot of comments about, well, I hope they're going to pay for it. And we invest a lot of money in publishing our research, and that's our commitment to our grantees and to the greater sector. But I would also say that we have learned a lot over the last couple of years, and it's quite evident that we need to move from the traditional publishing process to more open science and open research, and thinking about not the article as the end-all be-all, but actually a process. And it's not the end; it's a living, breathing thing, right? And so when we think about that, we have things like Gates Open Research, which we are launching in November, I think, if we're on track. Along with Welcome Open Research, they launched their open platform last year, and so we're following suit. Things like the Open Research Funders Group, where as a funders, we need a collective voice to think about policy harmonization, because as scientists, you have a lot to deal with, right? And so you have funders who are like, say this, do this, and you have your academic institutions, and you're just like, I just want to do science, man. Like, why do I have to do all this stuff? And we recently brought together folks from across patient groups and academia to talk about indicators of measurement of open science. Like, how do you measure open science? How do you know it actually works? What are those indicators? Because we don't have any. So that's very exciting. And so you'll hear more about that in the coming months. So that's it.
Terrific, thank you. So Alex, what are you thinking about in terms of a fundable model for new companies that are emerging in this area? I mean, I know you told us about precision medicine and what you're looking for there. But in a community where they're talking about open access and open source and transparency, how do you build a business model that can appeal to an investor like yourself?
Well, I think one of the things that is appealing is actually something surprising. And so that's hard. People often ask, like, what are you looking for? And often the most interesting things are something that I've never thought of and no one that I've been talking to has been thinking about, because that has potential to be something really new, and the word disruptive gets used too much, but something that actually has a chance of being something big and has really unlimited potential upside. So we can always make an investment and lose some money, right? But that's sort of capped. We have a fixed amount of loss that we can have there. But what's more exciting is when there's unlimited potential. I think certainly open access is a catalyst for all kinds of things. There is, I will admit, a little bit of a tension. And even here, there are a lot of people who are entrepreneurs or thinking about being one. The very slim book by Peter Thiel, Zero to One, which talks a little bit about the tension between trying to achieve monopolies, and then oftentimes a lot of disruption is actually trying to break monopolies. And I think there that attention will always be with us for any kind of resource, including information, human resource, attention, all kinds of things. But I don't think there's one single model, and I wouldn't prescribe any model. I think there's just fundamentals of, are you providing value to the world in some way? And if you are, usually there's a way to you can figure out a way to get paid for it. Someone will pay, right? If it's a humanitarian thing, there are people that will pay for that. If you're providing really wonderful new discoveries and you're a very creative person, there are people that will pay for that. If you're really good at market arbitrage and creating efficiencies in the marketplace, that actually typically pays very well. And if you're very good at sales, that also pays very well. But being very good at anything that helps people in some way and adds value to others is something that we can try to build a business model around. And part of it is being creative, because it's all an experiment. So venture capital is actually a lot like science, and it's all constant experimentation, and you want to reject hypotheses as fast as possible for as little utilization of resources. So you want to put a little bit of capital, reject hypothesis, little capital or a little bit of time, because time is actually a big part of what everyone has as their capital of their lives. just reject as many hypotheses as you can, and then quickly start to find things which are unusual or surprising that you continue to pick at and say, well, I can't reject this, I can't reject this, I can't reject this, I can't reject this, and that's where good things happen. So I guess I'm sort of skirting around and not answering your question, but hopefully I'm saying something interesting, because usually I like to go to a conference, and if I leave with one interesting idea that's controversial or crazy, then I feel like it was useful. So I'll try to think of something more controversial or crazy to say that people will be like, maybe half the people disagree with, and then we'll have some discussion. Because if we just say open standards are useful and important and essential for doing all this stuff, then I think everyone here is going to be in accord around that. So yeah, I'll try to think about something to push the limit of that.
Terrific. Carly, you talked about the 3 different types of programs that the Moore Foundation has behind data-driven discovery. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the program you launched in 2013 with the Sloan Foundation and the 3 participating universities, and what you've learned from that so far.
Yeah, so the program that she's referring to is the data science environments, and so we funded 3 universities for $10 million each, and then Sloan put in an additional $2 million per university, $2.5 million. So those 3 universities were NYU, University of Washington, and UC Berkeley, and the goal was really to give them money and flexibility to figure out what was going to work on their campus. And so we talked a lot about it as being an experiment. And how do we give them enough resources that they can explore the ways that they think are going to work on their campus to really bring about data-driven research across lots of disciplines, and make sure that they're fostering the kind of relationship building that needs to happen on academic campuses to really make these things take root. So academic campuses are notoriously difficult to change, and culture change is hard no matter where you are, particularly in academia, I think. And so the goal of this funding with the Sloan Foundation was really to try and figure out what pressure points we could work on to actually make changes happen in terms of data science and academia. And so I think in terms of things that we learned, it's an ongoing experiment. It's been really interesting to see the 3 universities take very different approaches, but there are some similarities across the 3, and I think one of them is around education and training, and trying to figure out how to get the right tools and the right skills in the hands of the people that are actually doing the research, particularly with relation to things like the new software that's coming out, or telling them about data sharing, or how to make their data reusable. Another theme that kind of has come out is the idea that physical space is actually very important, that you need to bring people together that maybe wouldn't otherwise have an interaction, to bring them into the same physical space so that they can see the parallels in their own work, even if they're not from the same discipline. And another big theme is around open science. And so figuring out the incentive structures that are needed to be in place to help these groups do better with reproducibility and transparency, and really thinking about what kinds of things are out there that they can take advantage of to really push that forward. And let's see, one of the other groups is tools, which of course comes up all the time. And so Jeremy alluded to a few. We fund a lot of tools, and we fund a lot of people that work on tools full time that are open source projects, and those are notoriously hard to sustain. You know, it's difficult to know how exactly a funding model should work for a project that's run by volunteers on their nights and weekends. And so that's been something that's been really interesting to see these 3 universities explore, is how do we support tool development when it doesn't fit neatly into the existing academic structure, and it certainly isn't necessarily rewarded in the current way that academia thinks about rewards and incentives.
Are there any conclusions to that question?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, so we're in we're just closing out the 3rd year of our experiment, and it's 5 to 6 years, depending on no-cost extensions and that kind of thing. So I think, you know, the overarching theme that I've taken from this is that culture change is hard, and data science, the things that can come out of data science collaborations across multiple disciplines are really interesting. And I think this is really what we're going to see coming about more and more at universities and other types of research institutions. We're going to see more and more of these ideas of facilitating collaborative, interactive groups of people that are really thinking about new approaches to problems and combining methods with disciplinary/domain research.
Great, thank you. So Tim, you described your scientific development environment this morning, and I'm wondering if you could share with us the experience you've had in actually implementing that environment in the academic environment. And what were the barriers to adoption, and how can we speed that up?
That's easy. We haven't implemented it in the academic environment. And the reason is because we found that the three critical ingredients in academia just aren't there. So you need the incentives, you need the educational background and concepts, and you need the tools. So academics generally don't pay for software, which isn't a problem because we'd give it for free to academics. But the educational gulf between what Riffyn provides in terms of treating an experiment as a measurement system is so great that we really don't have the time or the resources to teach it. And these are not new concepts. These are concepts that were derived from 75 years of statistics and manufacturing quality and everything else. But the foundation just isn't there. So you have to go across, sort of cross the chasm in academia to understand that, to be able to use it. And on the other hand, in industry, the uptake has been very good because industry has to be regimented to a certain degree about how they do their research so that they can deliver quality processes that produce quality products that actually treat disease and work, or that enzymes that actually work when they wash your clothes, or whatever it may be. And so the industry folks have already in many ways come around to this concept of measurement systems as processes, as experiments as measurement systems. And they have the sort of foundational structure to understand it, and they have the incentive coming from the demand for higher quality products, lower cost products, faster time to market, particularly in precision medicine, where the first one to market gets the whole pie and everyone else gets nothing. So they're driven to that. And so we've had great uptake there, but we really haven't entered the academic market. So to do that, I think it requires a partner who can fill in those gaps that we can't as a small company.
So training is a critical
Training is the most critical one.
Okay. So Robert, do you have a comment?
Yeah, just to make this, I want to respond to Tim as the academic on the panel, and also just to make this exciting.
Yeah.
Okay? So I'm going to disagree with you.
I sense
Tim.
a fight. Yeah.
I'm going to disagree with you. That's why we're far apart from each other. But we're both BU alums, so
Yeah.
we're good. So you talked about this customer orientation in the first segment. Mm-hmm. I don't think that academics should have a customer orientation. I actually worry a lot as an academic about when academics seem to have sort of a customer orientation. And I'll just sort of speak from my own experience as an economist. So our customers, sort of the customer for an economist is other economists and policymakers. And I really get worried when I see some economists, let's say, focused on policymakers, like very specific policymakers, as their sort of end customer. Because then you worry that the product, if you will, is getting tailored to what the customer wants. Now, I could see in a business setting how that's perhaps what you want. But in an academic setting, I think that there are probably good reasons why you would not want that. And so coming to like sort of the second segment that you're talking about, and I think this sort of maybe echoes some of the themes from the first panel. To a certain extent, maybe there's a role for academics to focus on sort of basic science, if you will, and for the more applied science, or sort of more applied implementation that's sort of customer facing, maybe it makes sense for that to happen, for that to be sort of what businesses focus on. But perhaps it's fine that academics don't have a customer in mind.
So do I get a response?
I leave that to Nancy. Yeah, I'm all ears though.
So I don't disagree because science is supposed to be exploratory, right? If it's overly directed, everybody's going to pile in one direction. You're not going to do the radiative exploration. The problem is that there's always a customer. So I'll give you two examples. One is, and it's a substitute or surrogate customer. So I sat in a taxi on the way back from a conference with a scientist who was up for tenure promotion at MIT. And he was a really accomplished scientist, lots of publications in science and all the good things that you're going to need to get tenure. And I asked him, he had a publication under review, or actually accepted at Science for publication, but not yet published. And I said, how much would I have to pay you to get you to revoke that publication and put it in, I don't know, Journal of Bacteriology, something that's respectable, but it doesn't have all the fanfare of science? And he said, probably about $150,000. So there's a customer there.
There's a price.
There's a price, but there's a
That's
customer paying. The customer is his tenure committee, right? He's basically directing his research towards fulfilling the obligations or the evaluation criteria of that tenure committee, because he gets promoted, he gets more salary, he gets a more stable job, he can put that on his grant applications, more money for his lab, more science publications, more money for the lab. It's kind of self-fulfilling. And so there always is somebody, and I think the customer, unfortunately, is granting agencies and policymakers and university promotion committees, which are not necessarily what any of us really want to be the customers of that science. It's just what's become the substitute. What we want is, and this is the other example, more of this ideal that I don't know if it was really true, but if you go back and think about how physics evolved in the 20th century, there's these tight groups, and this is probably more myth than reality, of physicists sitting in rooms trading back and forth ideas, and somebody proposes a theory and somebody else knocks it down, and it was so small and tight that they could basically be each other's customers and debate those ideas to perfection. And I think that's the kind of ideal we search for, but I don't actually see that happening, because we all have to put bread on the table, and to do that we have to navigate this academic gauntlet of granting and promotion and everything else.
Tim, that's actually not a myth. If you read The Making of the Atomic Bomb, you would know.
That's what I was
That's
thinking
actually
of.
what happened.
Great book. That was.
So,
yeah.
Robert, I just wanted to follow up on your question. So in talking about these incentives, is there something about the change from traditional models of automation in science to the open source approaches we've discussed today that will affect incentives to innovate? And are there experiences in other industries that we can learn from to help ensure that this process happens in a productive way?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer some of your questions, but not all of them, okay? I think, so earlier I was talking about some of the stuff that I found very exciting today. And so one of them was this idea of robots or automations that are complementing labor instead of just substituting for labor. The other thing that I found really exciting is this idea of open data, open access, or sort of technologies that lower, and I'm looking to Tim, right? Technologies that lower barriers to entry. So one of the things that policymakers recently have been sort of very concerned about is this issue actually that Alex raised earlier, which is about sort of growing monopolization in certain industries, so growing concentration in certain industries. And so the question, and so policymakers worry about this because when you have growing monopolies or sort of growing concentration, that at least theoretically and empirically tends to sort of lead to less innovation and less entrepreneurship, okay? And so the question is, well, how do we go about fixing that? So one approach is maybe antitrust or sort of regulatory approaches, but other approaches are actually trying to come up with ways to allow more competition, more entry by smaller firms into these industries, okay? And so, for example, this sort of technologies that lower the sort of lower the barrier to entry, such as the robotic tools that you guys are putting together, are sort of very exciting to me, because you could imagine that might lead to a whole lot of entry of entrepreneurial young scientists or older scientists, if you will, like myself, who then sort of produce new products and come up with new ideas that they can hopefully then take to market quickly, perhaps with the help of Alex.
So can I jump in too?
Sure.
So traditionally, in a lot of lab automation, you have this really expensive robot that there's not a whole lot of flexibility because it's this kind of lockdown system. Maybe a couple grad students and postdocs get trained how to use it, but it can't do a ton, so it sits empty collecting dust. And this is at least my experience in the lab. And so maybe someone figures out how to use it, but when they graduate or go start their own lab, it sort of sits there again for a while until someone else starts using it. that's not how really exciting science gets done, right? It gets done by people saying, well, how can I hack this and do the next thing as quickly as possible? How can I modify this? How can I get in there and break it? And if it's not too expensive, then I'm not intimidated about taking it apart. And we've seen this sometimes in the software side. So you asked about comparative industries. So many of the scientific device industry or big incumbent scientific device companies like Illumina, Agilent, Affymetrix, et cetera, all produce some software with their tools that helps you analyze the data. Now, what happened was people said, well, look, I'm getting raw data. I'm going to figure out how to do it better. And a whole ecosystem of hackers basically developed much better software. So no one uses the software that Illumina ships with a sequencer, right? You go and get something from Bioconductor or some third party because it's way better, because this is the cathedral versus the bazaar. And the bazaar will figure out how to do something interesting. And if we have these structures that like no one can get into and improve, then we're not going to have the ability, like people are going to be intimidated. This is kind of a citizen science, the kid at home. Like this is, all right, let's go with physicists. This is the Manhattan Project cohort grew up building crystal radio sets. Almost every physicist, if you read any physicist biography from the Manhattan Project, they all were like hacking radios as a kid. And so we need early tools that people are not afraid to go in. Like now, you're basically, I'm sure most people here are intimidated to take apart their laptop, right? There's not a thing that you can break, so you and your kids aren't going to learn how to hack it. So we need cheap, destructible tools that you learn how to hack it, and then awesome things come about. Because back when computers were hackable, people built computers themselves, and then we created a whole industry. And if this is true for biomedical devices and biological research, you can have a thing. So for $3,000, you can buy an Opentrons, and you can say, okay, what can I do with this? Well, I don't really know biology, but I can maybe program it to mix drinks at cocktail parties that I host, right? And I don't have to pay a bartender, and it'll pay for itself after, I don't know, I don't go to this, well, I guess I do, because I'm venture capitalist. I do go to this kind of parties that have bars. But, but that's a thing that you guys could do, okay? So that's an idea. Who else could come up with something? And for $3,000, you could break it, and again, maybe it's a different price point than most people, but for a research lab, that's a consumable. It's like under the $5,000 cap that you need for a capitalized expense for your lab. So you can buy a few. And so I used to do this in building computers. I'd want a really expensive computer, so you can't actually buy it without like going through all this overhead. So you'd buy parts, and you'd put it together after you got them all, because then it was like cheaper that way. So you get these cheap components that people can put together. We'll have whole new products and hopefully whole new industries. Sorry, that was a lot.
If I can jump on that, I think there's a really interesting kind of fundamental tension in what Alex was saying, and it relates to what Tim was saying before, also about education. And this is something I personally just feel really stuck on, so I'm super curious what this group thinks about it. To me, there's one drive that I certainly feel enormously personally, which is towards the kind of like do it yourself, mess around with things mentality. And I enormously feel that in the case of software, where I'm all for people not taking the software that ships out of the box and coming up with their own way of doing things, and it's open source, and there's an ecosystem, and there's a community of people trying new things. It actually applies to hardware just as much as software. I spent a lot of time with people building microscopes and designing entirely new ways to capture new kinds of images. All of that I think is amazing. I think it's absolutely critical for science to have that kind of open, frothy ecosystem. It also takes a lot of education to learn how to do that well. And the science we're all doing and the software we're all using is so complicated nowadays that any one human who, by the time they're in grad school has learned everything required to both build that like crazy new microscope and also learn the entire modern sort of open source Python stack and know everything about Jupyter and R and like how to do all of that, that's a lot to know. So on the one hand, we have this desire to have this kind of pure like hacker, open source everything, which I'm all about. On the other hand, there's this problem, which is that if we need to teach every single human doing science how to do all of that stuff, that may not scale. So the other drive we have is towards tools that kind of package it all up really nicely and make it super easy to use. I don't think that needs to be commercial, and we're certainly involved now in trying to, it's easy, I support a lot of tools that are are really easy to use, but are still open source and made freely and openly available to the entire research community. But maybe that doesn't scale either. So I think in both cases, it's like tools are great to be really, if they're really easy to use, that may be a way to get more people sort of doing things faster and easier, but then you have the problem that it's kind of a closed box, and maybe there are only so many ways to do that and make it free and open. On the other hand, it'd be awesome if everyone learns how to do all this stuff themselves, but that may not scale either. I feel like Carlee, in some ways, is one of the most people who've thought the most about the difference between these two things by looking at her work at Moore, because in some ways you've been exploring both of these models. And I don't know what the answer is. Maybe we just have to do both of them. But I think it's a really interesting tension.
So Jeremy, on that point, we have probably 10 or 15 minutes left, and I do want to allow people to ask questions, but I also wanted to have a really full discussion because this panel is so great, and we don't usually get people like you together to talk about these issues. So just in closing this meeting, I want to ask you, how can an institution like the Global Biological Standards Institute help the Chan-Zuckerberg Initiative to advance its work? And are there specific steps that you would like to see come out of this meeting and discussion today that might assist your initiative?
This answer might be a cop-out, but I think this is true. To me, the most important thing to come out of a meeting like this is basically people meeting each other that can continue in a very targeted way some of the discussions around ideas that we're talking about now. I'm looking around the audience and see a bunch of people I've had really interesting conversations with and want to have a lot more, as well as on this panel. So in my view, that's the reason to bring people like this together in this kind of environment, is to start really interesting conversations and then figure out where it goes next. I know that's kind of a cop-out, but it's actually what I think.
Thanks. So Tim, can you address that also? What kind of steps do you think GBSI could take next?
Well, I think I already said. The first is building consumers for science. Not that they can do that alone, but help. I mean, they're an organization that has some bandwidth to do, kind of a think tank to consider ideas and propose ideas on that. The other is the educational component. It's really no one's fault, but it's really abysmal in terms of the fundamental understanding of experimental design. I never learned it until I was 15 plus years into science, and I didn't learn it from academia. I learned it from industry, and we need help. We need to get those messages and those trainings and that education out to people. So those are my two thoughts.
So Carlee, could you address that? I mean, is there an initiative that GBSI could pursue with funders to help advance this field in this area?
I think that there's a lot of, particularly in the funder community, I found there's a lot of a lack of kind of breaking through the barriers and getting into some of the conversations that have happened today. And so kind of targeting and reaching out to people that maybe don't always get engaged in those discussions, like funders, but also the researchers themselves, and kind of doing some matchmaking around getting people together that maybe otherwise wouldn't necessarily speak with one another. They're all thinking about these things. So there's all these stakeholders in the groups, but are we really engaging one another productively and actually listening and understanding what the different needs are of the different communities? It's very easy to start pointing fingers, which I think was brought up on the last panel, and saying, oh, well, why aren't the publishers should make us do it? And I certainly have heard a lot of people say, well, why don't the funders make or the researchers do it? And of course, you can't. It's like the parents, right? You can't force that. So just engaging in discussions and making sure that type of thing continues to happen, I think, is a really good, productive use of energy.
Terrific. Jennifer, how can we help the Gates Foundation?
I would like to see more engagement with the entire community. I think for us as a funder, we hang out with other funders and we have our grantees, but I think there's a missing element with academic institutions and research scientists, right? So especially around academic advancement, every single thing that we do, I tell you, it's like, well, we can't do that because people need to publish, and I just don't know what to do about that because there's so many awesome, really cool things that we could be doing if we just weren't so fixated on that. So I would really love to have conversations around how to break that free and to enable scientists to do their best without feeling that they have a risk to their $150,000 incentive for not publishing in that journal. And so that's what I would like to see.
Great. Alex, how can we work with an investment firm like you to identify the business models and incentives?
Well, certainly if you encounter interesting companies, certainly send them my way. But I think in the general case, I think keep on trucking would be my Northern California way of saying, I think this is a solvable problem. So, standards go back to, you need standards to do business, right? I mean, you need to know what a pound of grain is, or a cocoa of rice, or a hogshead of ale, in order to do some transactions. And this will continue as people create new things. We need to develop new ways of measuring it, new ways of defining what it is, and that's just an evolving process. And, whether it's NIST or GBSI who's coming out, or the FDA is actually even there, we don't think of them as a measurement agency, but by defining what you need to do for a clinical trial, they're basically just finding the measurement endpoints that you need for various kinds of things in human therapeutics. So I think this is an evolving process, and you just need to keep working on it. I don't think it's solvable, but I think it's necessary.
Mm-hmm. Great. And Robert, is there a particular research regimen or program that you think could help to advance this effort more quickly?
So again, as a social scientist, I'm sort of more focused on outcomes for people and firms, if you will. And I think that I've heard about a lot of interesting initiatives that folks in the room have, a lot of interesting technologies and products that people in the room have. One thing that we are really, I'm just sort of speaking selfishly here as a researcher who does a certain thing. One thing that we really don't have a good handle on is how different types of automation, or standards around automation, if you will, are affecting productivity within a firm or within a lab, replicability for that matter, if that's sort of the productivity in a lab that we care about, the effect on labor. So my pie in the sky vision would be, Khosla Ventures, for example, giving $1 million, just off the top of my head, to GBSI to fund a field experiment of sorts, where there's sort of like two, yeah, there we go. That's why we're sitting next to each other. To fund, say, a field experiment where there's take 200 labs and 100 of them get your guys' equipment, and another 100 just get some consulting or something like that. And we track these labs over the course of a couple of years, and we see what happens in terms of effect on labor, effect on productivity, and things like that.
Terrific. So
Just
let's throw it open to the audience for some questions. I'm sure you're all boiling over right now. Megan?
Thanks. This has been a really great discussion. I have a couple of questions. The first is, you each, or many of you, represent sort of these special pots of mission-driven funding. What has your experience been trying to work with other types of institutions, and especially sort of federal funding agencies, in aligning some of these incentives in your programs? And related to that, on the topic that we just discussed, funding for sort of the science of science and innovation policy, how much of that do you see as within your organization, as something internal, versus something you sort of fund externally? I think, Jennifer, you alluded to an initiative you might be starting in metrics for open science, but can you speak a little bit to how you fund sort of that evaluative assessment component, and how that interacts with the sort of philanthropic or venture versus federal funding divide?
So I would say that evaluation and measurement are very important to our co-chairs, and they want to understand the return on their investment. And so one of the things, when we think about the research that we fund, we didn't have a way to really track the impact of the research, right? So when we launched our policy, we decided to create a new system that would enable us to track research from submission to the end. And so we have this new system called Kronos, and it was built to scale to other funders. And now we can track data, like our researchers are submitting on this date, then they were accepted on this date, and then it was published and made available on this date. And so when we think about, in terms of our research, we are still using altmetric to think about a different way of measuring the impact. Like, did it make it into a policy brief? What are the citations? Of course, then you have Twitter and all of that. So then you make those connections. I would say measurement is in our program teams, because I work on policy side, so in our program teams, there is a big component like outcome investing. We want to make sure that what we're investing in actually we know what's going on, right? I think a lot of times as funders, we say, all right, we're going to do this, we give you $30 million and have at it, but we don't really have a lot of engagement around that or tools to help with ensuring that what we have funded in core of our mission and in service of our mission is actually doing what it needs to do. So, yeah.
I'll just mention that the Moore Foundation has an entire group that is for measurement, evaluation, and learning. And so they work directly with the program staff to try and figure out how to set up ways to measure outcomes, and there's all these phrases that are very social science oriented, if you ask me, but we're trying to work with them to figure out how to get them to apply to the science program specifically. And so I think we are talking to Kronos to see if that's a system that we want to put into place, but we're also thinking about the bigger picture and engaging with people who are experts in measurement and social sciences to really do that. And then also within the data science environments, we have an entire measurement group. It's a set of ethnographers that we work with who are evaluating those data science environments kind of on the ground and creating primary research based on what they're experiencing there.
Maybe to say just quickly with respect to the first question about sort of aligning to other interests, I mean, I can say something at CZI that we're super excited about and care a lot about is making sure that whatever we do, ultimately isn't just for the particular project we might be building something for when it comes to, say, software, but that it has the potential to kind of be exported or made relevant or useful to other projects. And we really believe in kind of supporting all of science as an ecosystem and raising all boats. So to us, that means anything we build when it comes to software, doing it in the open, as in like literally repos on GitHub, public with an MIT license from the time we start the project, and everyone involved is sort of committed to that. Being really public about what we're building and kind of what roadmaps are, and early rather than later looking for opportunities where other groups, whether it's sort of other governmentally funded science or other scientists or other infrastructure developers or whoever to be able to potentially reuse. And then lastly, trying as hard as possible to build software and infrastructure in a way that is modular and generalizable with good, clean separation of concerns so that pieces of things we have built for one project can actually effectively be reused in other projects and not sort of built once for one thing and then never touched again.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, actually, I guess this is kind of going back a bit, but I want to comment on something you said, Jeremy, where you were saying that if you're doing hacking and open source, that it either needs to be simple and kind of understandable by people with kind of lower level skills, or it needs to really be something that is only able to have people who are very, very experienced engage with it. And you're saying how does that scale? And I think that people actually scale once you start having these community labs nationally and internationally, as we've started to have. One of our projects is now an international project working with multiple labs in different cities around the world. And the other thing I'd like to add is that sometimes I feel that people think, okay, I'm bringing on someone to my team who knows nothing about genetics, we're doing genetic engineering, how is this going to work? But oftentimes you're gaining an adult with really deep, well-developed skills. And so it's more about your ability to communicate effectively with people who know where you very few points of knowledge between you. But for our Open Insulin project, one of the people we've been working with, I mean, she's a very well-known policy expert and diabetes activist. She's a great person for us to work with. But maybe if we were like, oh, okay, I'm only going to talk to someone with a PhD in genetics, we couldn't have her perspective. So I think that, you may, broadening the people you're working with can often be really valuable and effective in ways that are hard to understand before you start working with them.
I think that's a fantastic point. Yeah, all for 100%, super interdisciplinary teams working on these things.
Hi, Hi, thanks. I guess what I have to say is kind of an observation, although there might be a question hidden in here. I've sort of heard a couple of snippets throughout this panel on things that are particularly important to me as someone who heads a data repository. We've heard someone on the panel talk about having a certain level of discomfort around the idea of a customer on the end of this interaction, which is something that I've seen on Twitter in different areas of sort of, maybe the possible misalignment of commercial or for-profit organizations in an academic space. There's been conversations about that. I've heard sort of the opposite of that from other folks saying that no, there really is a customer, and you need to solve a problem, and you need to create a good service and have value, which is something that I really strongly believe in. And at the same time, this sort of ecosystem where we've got different funders that are involved with creating new projects and new opportunities for all these new innovative ideas that are coming out or going on. But in a sense, in one sense, I feel like there's a great opportunity here, and there's a lot of unknowns that we can kind of develop ourselves. But on the other hand, I want to say that I feel kind of like it feels a little still like the Wild West a little bit. And as an organization that's sort of, been quite successful in convincing a variety of stakeholders that open data, in my experience, is worthy of investment, has a lot of services, incredibly important, that we've been pretty successful in convincing a variety of stakeholders in this area, but at the same time still really struggle to show value, to raise funds to build and to grow, to provide those services that we know that this user wants, but this other user isn't really sure how to pay for, and is working with funds with an organization that is asking us to become sustainable. And oftentimes the type of conversations that I have is around my organization's business model, because that's an interesting and somewhat unique thing that we do. So a lot of organizations are asking, how is it going, and what is it like, and can you share your experiences? And it's all, in one sense, it's really, I'm seeing this real tension of all of this opportunity, but it still really feels like the Wild West, and it's awful hard to plan on growing, on creating that new value, on that new pace. So, I don't know if we have time to get deeply into questions, but I'm just really interested in people's advice around planning for the future in this environment where it still feels, in my mind, a bit shaky.
So that could be one rung on a future program for GBSI, is to talk about that and to sponsor workshops on that and to get people together that are intensely interested in that, it seems to me. Because this is a question that we struggle with as an organization as well. So it's not something that, you're in all by yourself. And so that could be part of a roadmap moving forward out of this meeting.
And I would say to that we have that question a lot. So we have all this data that's produced from our grant, and our grantees are like, okay, so now what do I do with it? And it's really cool. And so whose responsibility is that to sustain the data repositories? And how do you create a business model that enables science to flow, right? So we struggle with this a lot. I've talked to our finance folks and explaining to them the way the way we publish research and how it works. And she was just like, I don't really understand this. I can't understand why the researchers are giving away their content, and this is a very frustrating conversation, is what she said. And I'm like, you're right. And so then you have the APC model, and so I would really love to have a conversation around that, because we don't have an answer to that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Lenny?
Yeah. It's pretty rare to have funders and VCs on the same panel. Mm-hmm. And I was just thinking, when it comes to venture capital, in what we've seen today, right, there's CodeOcean, Authorea, Protocols, Riffyn, Science Exchange, all of them have raised venture capital. So in some sense, of course, we would say there's not enough, it's hard to raise money, but the VC community is actually not bad at funding efforts in this space. I wonder if there is opportunity for funders to be talking more to VCs, because we can raise money and we can build platforms, academics that know about us. I think the incentives are there to adopt platforms and, SciNote, open source lab notebook. There are incentives already there. The scientists that know about these kinds of tools and efforts, they're very eager to adopt and share. So I think the culture is there. Most scientists are open. If the tools save them time, if they're designed well, there will be adoption. But you can get the venture capital to build these things, but scientists don't know that you exist, right? And VCs aren't going to be able to let academics know that there's Opentrons that they can buy for $3,000, right? So maybe there's opportunity for funders to be talking more to VCs about what are the things that are already out there that are pretty amazing that we could be not necessarily requiring, but letting our researchers know about, right? Promoting, encouraging, connecting the things that have been funded and that have been created so that they gain adoption and get to sustainability and get to those business models.
Good point.
If I can,
Yep.
20 seconds, if I can just add to what Lenny said and what Tim said before. So we're still struggling with academia and providing that service, but it's absolutely true, like what Tim said, academia simply isn't budgeting for this kind of tools. And we hear a lot of times from people that are willing to pay for, let's say, our advanced features, they say, oh, I see value in this, I would like to pay. It's just my grant is not structured in a way that I can pay that much for software.
Right.
So I think this is also something that needs to change, because I think like from companies that provide services like ours, it's usually the discussion that we have, well, we anyway need to give them for free to scientists. And it's like, sure, but then, that comes at a cost of us not being able to hire people that can maintain this properly, the lack of support that Tim was mentioning, that ultimately these people need to get educated, to know how to learn this kind of software. So like to add to this, maybe this is also a discussion to have for the grant proposals. They require to maintain the data, but there is no, at least to my understanding, not enough resources going into actually paying for licenses and services for the software.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I'd argue that they're paying for it, they just don't actually account for it. So you have grad students spending their time writing databases, you have data lost, you have failure to reuse, you have all kinds of costs in the system because of that.
So actually, I would like to add to this additionally, and maybe the panel can take this as a question. Europe has actually been very forward-thinking in some of these data repository sorts of thoughts, where some of the countries have now said, okay, some percentage of all of your grant funding goes to taking care of the data, making sure that it's maintained and all of that fun stuff. I mean, can you guys kind of address this? Because this is a real question, right? So if you're going to say, I care about the data, where's that money?
Yeah, for sure. And I don't have an easy answer for that. I mean, it makes sense, right? That if we're wanting the data and we care about enough to fund a big grant, where is that data going to live and who's going to curate it? And I think it comes back to that business model and how businesses are. How do they scale? How are they sustainable? Who are their customers, right? And so when I think about that, I think about the Chronos system that we built. And we built it for us, but we also built it to scale, because if we needed that information, other funders would too. And I'm really interested in how they're going to scale. Like, who are their customers? How are they going to be sustainable? I have no idea what that's going to look like. And I think that it'll be really interesting to see, but it's a larger question, because we can keep giving money, right? I mean, for us, it's like, all right, fine, we'll give you this, we'll give you that. But it's not, but to what end and to what purpose? And so I think that's a question that we talk about collectively. And so that's why I love having these conversations, because you just, like Jeremy said, just keep talking and figure out what we can do together. So that's, I don't know. What do you think, Carleen?
Well, I'll say that we're happy to pay for these things if people put them in their grant proposals. The challenge is that they don't want to use whatever budget they think they have to pay for something like that, right? Because that takes away from that graduate student they wanted to get or whatever. So within the Moore Foundation, it's very much specific to the program officer. And so for the grants that I'm in charge of, I want a data management plan, and I want to see that they have a plan in place and that they've allotted money for the types of things that they're going to say they're going to do. But I'm one of 50 plus program staff at the foundation, and most of them don't have the knowledge, expertise, or interest in asking those kinds of questions. And so there's a level of education that has to go into the funder community, I think, to assert that we need that type of funding. But I think also these funders are not the ones that we should be talking to. NIH, maybe it would be a good one to start with.
So I think we just have room for one more question. Yvonne?
So one of the things I've noticed in both the panels this afternoon, and I think it's great that everyone is really wanting to drive change and everything else, but there is a very large industry out there of the big vendors today, and we don't actually have a voice of the big vendors in the room, which I think is a gap. Because we can't sort of do this on our own. I don't think we can completely defeat them, and I don't think it's wise to completely defeat them. So it'd be great to sort of, get them on board and make them change as well.
Right, how to engage the larger vendors, absolutely.
Can you, who are you talking about?
Vendors, publishers?
Like publishers? Or
No, instrument suppliers and,
So,
system suppliers.
We have a representative from Thermo Fisher. Becton Dickinson is represented here, but there's only a few of them, right?
And they're not on any panels, so.
Right, that's true, yeah. Some of them were invited.
They're scared.
Okay, on that note, I just want to say a few words to wrap this meeting up. So thank you very much to all of our panelists.